I know, wokeism, but bear with me a minute. I think I found a new way of looking at this, and because I've commented on this in some capacity in the past, and because apparently it's over now, and because it does touch on some important issues that I care about, free speech, censorship, progressive values, the media and ethics, and because I think there's still a lot of confusion on this topic, well, let's think about this question of whether wokeism is really over.
Woke storytelling. Woke word salad.
Woke activism. Super woke ad.
Everything is woke.
Dark woke. Dark woke. Woke Colombian.
Hop on the woke bandwagon of woke ideology.
You know, they've gone woke.
Being woke.
Woke activism.
Into a woke direction. By woke Wall Street maybe coming to an end.
It's why wokeism, like a drug or like a violent spouse, will say, if you ever leave me, you'll die.
Anyone who tries to think seriously about this topic will quickly get a headache because I've realised woke means so many different things to so many different people. For example, take critical race theory on one hand and something like outrage culture on Twitter on the other. These are two really completely different things, but there are many that would identify something about each as woke. Now, bear with me here, but I think that thing at its core is censoriousness, directed by or culminating around university campus talks, newspaper editorial boards, social media moderators, public shaming by the online mob, the pressure to sanitize or modify language, to ban books, to harshly criticize films. All of this, to its critics, is the core of wokeism, the censorious impulse. I want to take that impulse seriously because it sounds immediately negative, an awful thing, Orwellian, fascist, propagandistic, which it obviously often is, but it's also something we all do all of the time. We have rules in classrooms, we have cut-off points in meetings and rules about who can speak and when. We moderate social media scams and harassment and pornography. We self-censor in polite company. The list goes on and on, so some form of censorship is the norm. But calling wokeism censoriousness doesn't explain the novelty of this current moment. Political correctness is perennial, from the Reformation to Mao to the McCarthy era to Victorian morality. Public shaming is, of course, nothing new. Every period has some form of its own pillory. But here's the thing. We assume we've gotten more tolerant over time, and that public shaming rituals and practices and repressive codes and laws, whether that's for being a communist or for being a heretic or for being gay, have decreased over time, that we are more liberal. But for many critics of wokeism, this moment is getting worse again. The woke mind virus, the new Puritans, the cancelling of the American mind. To many, the woke mob represent a force that is, in some sense, new and, in some significant ways, worse than the kind of censorship or repression seen in some places in the past. Take Greg Lukianoff and Ricky Schlott's book, The Cancelling of the American Mind. Lukianoff is the president of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, an organisation whose, quote, mission is to defend and sustain the individual rights of all Americans to free speech and free thought. They defend, often in court, the rights of professors and students who have had their First Amendment right to free speech violated on campuses across America. And this here is the key to all of it. Lukianoff makes the very specific claim that, quote, more professors have been terminated during the era of cancel culture than in the era of McCarthyism. And that, quote, cancel culture is happening at such a scale that historians will be studying it in 50 to 100 years, much like we study the Red Scare and the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, put aside the always dubious claim that in 50 to 100 years it is I, the writer, that you are reading that will be on the right side of history, Lukianoff points as evidence to the almost 200 professor terminations from the FIRE database in the cancel culture period, and that, quote, that exceeds even the estimated 100 to 150 professors terminated in the second Red Scare. They also make the claim that 91% of professors said in a poll that they self-censor, compared with only 9% during McCarthyism. And the book includes this graph, showing a notable uptick in cancellations in around 2018 to 2020. So this is a new type of censoriousness, which Lukianoff and Schlott define as an uptick beginning around 2014 and accelerating in 2017 and after of campaigns to get people fired, disinvited, deplatformed, or otherwise punished for speech that is or would be protected by First Amendment standards and the climate of fear and conformity that has resulted from this uptick. They point out that both the left and the right do it, and that, quote, cancel culture arose when social media enabled the most instantaneous creation of outrage mobs. They go on to discuss some of the biggest cases as evidence. In one case, for example, Gordon Klein was suspended by UCLA for an email responding to a suggestion that black students be given special treatment during George Floyd protests. Klein cited Martin Luther King on not judging someone based on the colour of their skin, asked where he should draw the line on someone with mixed parentage, and said he was uncomfortable sorting white from black students, especially when classes have been online only. You might disagree with it, but it's not an unreasonable email by any stretch of the imagination. You can read the email, it's linked below. Despite this, Klein was suspended after a petition with over 75,000 signatures. He was later reinstated after fire intervened. Or take this case in the UK, in which police had to apologise for having a billboard that said being offensive is an offence. Or this story of a Hamline art professor who was fired after showing an image of Muhammad in art class after giving plenty of warning that it would happen. Students complained and kicked off a, quote, firestorm. Now, cases like this are pointed to as evidence that cancel culture is so bad that it's worse than McCarthyism, and it's a convincing case. I think personally being fired for any of these things that I've just talked about seems wrong to me. And so, apparently, to most of the public, most people agree that cancel culture has become a problem, 82% in one survey. And in 2022, the New York Times admitted that cancel culture is real, saying that, quote, America has a free speech problem. But going through this book, and books like it, books like Andrew Doyle's The New Puritans, for example, I couldn't help but notice that in case after case, things were never quite as they seemed. In Fire's database of cancellations, there are almost 1,400 entries. Lukianoff and Schlott write that of these, nearly 2/3 resulted in the professors getting sanctioned and 1/5 losing their jobs. From the public perception of cancel culture and wokeness, I don't know whether to do that every time or not, I feel like wokeness has to be put in air quotes for some reason. You might have some vague understanding of wokeness and cancel culture, that these people were forced out for refusing to call trans women, or for having a poorly timed gag about the gays, or for the sin of uttering an outdated turn of phrase, for refusing to bend the knee, and so on, and so on, and so on. So I ran the dataset through ChatGPT and asked it to return the cases that, quote, resulted in termination, firing, or forced resignation. ChatGPT returned 151 results. Now, I know this is an imperfect method and AI might be a bit inaccurate here, but remember, from the same data, Lukianoff and Schlott say that there have been almost 200 professor terminations in the cancel culture period, and that, quote, that exceeds even the estimated 100 to 150 professors terminated in the second Red Scare. So 150, I think, is a reasonable representation of the dataset to start with. Okay, so many of them do conform to the public perception of censorious woke cancel culture. For example, Jewish professor Chana Newman won a court case back in 2018 in which she claimed she was forced out of Point Park University for her views on Zionism and for an alleged comment she made about the Me Too movement. This aligns with classic liberal lefty woke cancel culture. But scrolling through, many of them, if not most of them, aren't really about what you call woke stuff at all. Many of the terminations are because of what seemed to me like pretty controversial conduct. One says that Greer was forced to resign in 2001 for creating hostile learning environments and for not preparing syllabuses. Another was let go for their past links with the Ku Klux Klan and violently resisting arrest. Some were fired for viewing pornography, for bad performance over the years. One was fired for, quote, terminated after she was recorded telling an Asian American family to go back to their home countries. Or take this case of someone who says they were fired for using a, quote, phallic prop in a school play. The truth, though, according to university officials at the private Catholic university, was that he wasn't rehired after accusations of sexual harassment. They said the university can confirm that the claims were unrelated to the content or props of the play. Some of the cases seem like unreasonable firings at first glance. One professor was fired for confusing the names of 2 black students. Now, that's all it says in FIRE's dataset. But again, a bit of Googling reveals that he was actually dismissed for a series of emails. One of them was 9 pages long to his students about why he did it. Now, maybe the dismissal was still unreasonable, but it's hard to know without knowing what the content of the emails was and what was discussed. And a 9-page email sounds a little bit odd to me, but the point is he was dismissed not for the confusing of the names like it says in the dataset, but for those emails. Or take a case in the UK, pointed to by Andrew Doyle. He says in the New Puritans that the Reverend Dr. Bernard Randall, the school chaplain at Trent College in Derbyshire, told me about training sessions in which staff were instructed to chant "smash heteronormativity," and when he delivered a sermon about the importance of respectfully challenging such ideological viewpoints, he was reported to prevent the government's anti-terrorism programme, and he was then dismissed by the college. Again, this conforms to the public perception of woke hysteria, but Doyle leaves out a few inconvenient details. A bit more research once again reveals that Randall actually went to court over the unfair dismissal and the court rejected it. Unlike Doyle's very selective and mild interpretation of what happens, the court documents read that his first sermon strongly implied that it's sinful to alter the body given by God, implied that marriage can only be between a man and a woman, and that family works best when a woman, with her tone of voice, looks after the children. The school then received a number of complaints from pupils and staff who were upset by the underlying message that it is a sin to be gay. The sermon then included the following quote from Leviticus: "If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them." Compare that to how Doyle reported on this issue. He said he talked about the training sessions and the smashing heteronormativity, and a sermon about the importance of respectfully challenging such ideological viewpoints. How could you disagree with that? Until you look further into the case. Being gay is an abomination, shall be put to death, blood is upon them. A woman should stay at home, marriage is only between a man and a woman, and altering your body, I presume this is a reference to being trans, is sinful. This was Randall's message to school kids. Take another case. In 2021, Richard Taylor was let go from St John's University for asking students whether the positives of slavery justify the negatives. Now, Lukianoff and Schlott present Taylor's debate inducing a question as a well-meaning lesson about the effects of slavery on trade and biodiversity, saying the following: "While both slavery and the abuse of indigenous populations were mentioned on several slides, they were not the focus of the lesson. In fact, it would take an extraordinarily unnatural reading of the question to intuit that the ultimate discussion question of a 46-slide lesson was directed at the 7 slides that referenced slavery." Lukianoff and Schlott then mention an Instagram post from students claiming that, quote, "he poses a threat to the education of our student body," and that Taylor was targeted for, quote, "his status as a former NYPD officer and Marine, plus that there were 300 bias complaints. Wokeness gone mad, right?" Now, with this evidence presented to you, you might conclude, as I did, that Taylor might have made some unfortunate comparisons or a bit of a mistake, but that firing him goes too far. But Lukianoff and Schlott don't mention, and I have to assume purposefully omit, as they write about this extensively in their book, so it must be quite close to the case, that there were multiple reports about Taylor from before the incident, including from faculty members, and that students had only raised his status as an NYPD officer because he'd had complaints about him as an officer too. Taylor had also told black students who complained about having to discuss the positives of slavery that they wouldn't be here without slavery. Or take both Lukianoff, Schlott and Doyle's discussion of book banning. Lukianoff and Schlott write that, quote, according to a report from the American Library Association, 2021 saw the largest number of banning attempts recorded in their 20-year history. The group recorded 729 individual challenges to 1,597 book titles, up from just 273 in 2018 and 777 in 2019. Doyle points to a case in the Waterloo Region District School Board in Canada which identified and removed books that were considered, quote, harmful to staff and students. Doyle says that other school libraries, quote, did away with, unquote, copies of Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, both following complaints about, quote, racist, homophobic or misogynistic language and themes. Did away with. Sounds pretty Orwellian, right? Sounds pretty totalitarian, and he compares it to book burning. Of course, the truth is a little bit different. If this is the case he's talking about, then the school board didn't do away with books, didn't rip them up, didn't destroy them, it didn't burn them. It changed the curriculum so that To Kill a Mockingbird was no longer required reading. The Independent reported that, quote, teachers will still be allowed to use the book in optional lesson plans. Curriculums change all the time. That's not book banning, and it's an interesting discussion. I could well imagine myself defending the inclusion of a classic like To Kill a Mockingbird, but would be predisposed to listening to the arguments against too, especially when there are so many books in the world to choose from to teach kids. Doyle doubles down though. He says the Ottawa Carleton District School Board removed copies of William Golding's Lord of the Flies on the grounds that the themes of the book were, quote, outdated and too focused on white male power structures. But again, Doyle uses what I think can only be described as dishonest language here. He literally says, quote, removed copies, when instead, once again, what really happened, as Boing Boing reported, the school board removed William Golding's classic Lord of the Flies from its curriculum. Now, changing a curriculum is very different from removing copies, which implies that stuff was taken from a library, destroyed maybe. Over and over, these cases are presented as unreasonable attempts to silence, to ban, to censor, and to cancel, when the truth seems to be that in a large number of them, they're either based on genuinely controversial conduct, like masturbating in a school office, or are the result of reasonable discussions about syllabuses and teaching. Syllabuses. You might agree or disagree with the outcome of each case. And if you're a thinking person, you're not going to agree with all of them or disagree with all of them. There's going to be differences, which proves the point that there's a reasonable discussion to be had. But what all of this doesn't seem to be, for the most part, is a product of some new woke mind virus, a new cultish religious puritanism. What frustrates me is that in an otherwise good book about free expression, Lukianoff and Schlott repeatedly omit details that harm their case and would risk the reader empathising with those making the complaints. And they consistently say that this period is worse than McCarthyism. This completely muddies the waters. Comparing cancel culture to the McCarthy era is, I don't want to say ridiculous, but a very bad comparison. Remember, it's based on the claim that the 200 or so terminations of professors in the FIRE database exceeds even the estimated, quote, 100 to 150 professors terminated in the second Red Scare. But first, as we've already seen, some of those, if not many of those, 200 firings were for things like watching porn in the office, or in another case for not working productively with another department in the university which was a requirement of the job, or in another case it says for performance over the years. In other words, day-to-day, timeless, bureaucratic stuff, and not really comparable to political repression. And the number they cite for professors terminated during the Red Scare, 100 to 150, comes from one single article, a single source, and it gives the impression that the Red Scare was limited to this and a Hollywood blacklist that they mention of 300 people in the movie industry. But in his book on political repression in America, political scientist Robert Justin Goldstein writes that, quote, overall, approximately 11,000 people were fired as a result of government and private loyalty programs, and that, quote, the federal loyalty program alone dismissed approximately 3,900 government employees and 5,400 employees from private employers, and, quote, that hundreds of public school and college teachers were fired by numerous institutions during this period, generally on grounds of admitted or suspected Communist Party membership or for exercising their Fifth Amendment rights. So I think, again, this is either selective reading or a pretty dishonest trick. Lazy at best by just referring to one article about McCarthyism and trying to use that to make a point about how bad this period is. Lukyanov and Schlott omit so much, so often, to balance the scales in the way they want that suits their argument. This is not a good approach to scholarship. McCarthyism numbers are deflated or ignored, and cancel culture figures are inflated or exaggerated, both by omitting or amplifying certain details on both sides. The authors continually imply that self-censorship is worse today than in the famously conformist McCarthyist 50s. Do you really think that's true? Am I missing something here? I mean, just take a look online. Take a look at the stream of cancelled celebrities in mainstream newspapers or on popular podcasts or TV shows claiming that they've been cancelled while being given a platform to talk about them being cancelled. Take a look at Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or Reddit and the abundance of controversy and information and argument. Take a walk around any number of demonstrations around Europe and America, from the left all the way across to the right. Do you really think, after looking at all of this, that self-censorship is worse today than in the 50s? I'm not sure right-wing professors are hiding books from Thomas Sowell from FBI informants in their homes. Quick one. I've tried to avoid ads and sponsorships so far. I like that Then and Now is fan-funded, Patreon-funded, but that means that in-depth, well-researched, long-form content like this needs your help. So if you want these videos ad-free and early and join in the discussion and get the scripts, if you want a 2-hour-long course on how historians think about history, how they do it professionally, and how you can think differently about your approach to understanding history too, if you want stuff like that and more, you can do so for as little as $1. Have a look in the link below, please. If you can't do that, then like, subscribe, share, all the rest, but a Then and Now membership will be worth your time and help the channel out. Thank you. Now, you might ask, why does it matter whether it's worse or different or new? What matters is free speech and toleration and fairness now, in the present, today. But there's a reason why people who argue against cancel culture and wokeism have to try and say it's new. You see it very often, if it's new, it's usually then blamed on some radical form or source of leftist or progressive thought, from postmodernism to critical race theory to discourse analysis to Maoist political correctness. And I do think it's often true that there is something new here. There is an emphasis on postmodern discourse analysis and language. There is a liberal bias in institutions and universities and the media, and I think there is more groupthink online and outrage culture whipped up by social media. But there's also a sense of many of the cases in the FIRE dataset being as old as the hills, the timeless results of faculty politics or bureaucratic dogfights. In 1974, coal miners in Kanawha in America led a walkout in protest of school textbooks which included more multiracial content, including about Allen Ginsberg, the poet, Malcolm X, James Baldwin, and Freud, amongst others. These new textbooks caused such a backlash that 11 mines were shut and thousands picketed outside schools with signs like, "I have a Bible, I don't need those dirty books." Protesters sung a song that went, "They came for the souls of our precious ones, and now we're gonna resist. Now they come for our kids with their dirty books and their one world plan, but they got a surprise from us mountain folk, because now the Lord said stand." Now I sit and read quite a bit of history, and my point is this. Stuff like this comes up all of the time. Stuff that could quite easily be described as woke today. Take your pick. The Red Scare, the Reformation, the French Revolutionary focus on sentimentalism, strict Victorian moral codes. The list goes on, and these are just the most obvious, but this is really just a constant throughout history, as is some type of varied call-out culture, public shaming, strict enforcement of repressive norms, groupthink, conformity, and social ostracism. These things aren't novel in wokeness. Critics might respond that, well, yes, but we're meant to have become more tolerant, and now we have an uptick of things like public shaming again. And I'll be honest, I don't quite know how to feel about all of this, because on the one hand, I agree, while on the other, it's clear that it's been exaggerated a lot too. And also, there has been a reasonable focus on, say, the experience of women in the workplace since Me Too. These seem like positive changes to me. On top of this, you have the tabloids, Fox News, GB News and Twitter reactionaries amplifying every edge case and calling everything under the sun woke, leading to what some have rightly called a moral panic. I mean, Exhibit A. That's not to say there's not some kind of a problem. Moral panics are always based in some small reality, but they're often exaggerated and used as a distraction when there are more important things to focus on. Is it any wonder that 82% of people think that wokeness is a problem when the most rare but extreme examples are trotted out by mainstream commentators and tabloid pundits as examples of the world going mad on a daily basis? Or take the differences between these data points. To prove the argument that we're cancelling ourselves to death, Lukianoff and Schlott write of students that more than 80% said they have self-censored their beliefs, 81% said they feel pressure to avoid discussing controversial topics in their classes, and almost 2/3 of students are worried about damaging their reputation because someone misunderstands something they have said or done. Now, I think that's bad, sure. But in what world do the majority of 18-year-olds on campus for the first time in their lives not self-censor quite a bit, not worry about every single thing they've said or are going to say? Does he remember what it's like to be a school kid? Does he remember what it's like to put your hand up and speak in front of a new group? This statistic doesn't really surprise me. And compare it to this 2023 study of 2,500 scholars, concludes that there is a plurality view suggesting no change in the quality of open debate over time. In total, almost as many political scientists reported on the basis of their own experience that open debate had improved as much as it had worsened, but that also, quote, right-wing faculty were slightly more likely to believe on the basis of their own experience that open debate had got a lot worse over time. And then on the question of, quote, experience of pressures to be politically correct, the same study concluded that, quote, the largest plurality of responses, 39%, reported that in their own experience there had been no change over time, but that 1/3 reported that these pressures had worsened, quote, somewhat or a lot, 36% in their experience, and that clearly outweighed the proportion feeling more positively than these pressures had got, quote, somewhat or a lot better, just 15%. So the majority think no change over time, but a large enough minority on the right believe that there has been a change. And this aligns with the study which concludes that in the US and in 23 comparable post-industrial societies, self-identified right-wing political scientists were most likely to report personal experience of a worsening cancel culture. Which, okay, fine, that's pretty good evidence of a significant change, but oddly that doesn't align with the rest of FIRE's data, which, out of those 150 job terminations that I downloaded since 2000, that's 6 per year across America, not exactly an epidemic, the majority of them are also classed as pressure to terminate from the right. 57 are from the left and 66 are from the right. And if you want to know more about that, there's a really good video from a channel called Brendan Miller on all of this. Go sub, Brendan does great political explainers. You'll like it. And all of this aligns with an open syllabus study of 5.5 million syllabi from 4,000 universities that found that so-called woke terms like critical race theory, structural racism, and transgender appear just 0.08% of the time, and terms like race and gender have been consistent over time and even falling since 2017, backing up the argument that the only real change has been the media, particularly the shock jock tabloid focus on all of this. Okay, so things are pretty messy, but I think I have a newish, goodish way of thinking about this a bit more clearly. Think about different speech settings: the classroom, the street corner, a social media platform, an office meeting. Some of them are more limited or zero-sum than others. What I post on social media doesn't take away from what you post on social media. We can both post as much as we want. But a university syllabus, the pages or the front page of a national newspaper, an office and its values and its direction and its debate about what should be done, all of these, they're much more zero-sum. In other words, there will always be debate and policy and exclusion around what the direction and the values are, what should be taught or not, what acceptable conduct is, who's included, who's excluded. Obviously, the differences between positive sum and zero sum speech settings matters in discussions about free speech. In positive sum speech settings, I think, we should be free speech maximalists. We should allow as much as possible. But in zero sum, we have to acknowledge there's going to be cut-off points, decisions made, people excluded, hirings, firings, rehirings, not rehirings, changes in values. And my point is that in those speech settings, what we've all been calling woke or censoriousness will likely continue, as it's always done throughout history. None of this is to say that the values and practices of free speech, toleration, open discussion aren't important, even crucial in both settings, nor that this isn't a really good book on thinking about freedom of speech, and that it's made me really think about how difficult freedom of speech is to stand by. A lot of the time, it doesn't just mean allowing people that disagree with you to speak, it means defending their right to speak too. A distinction that I think is important but often missed. It's difficult to foster environments of free speech. It's not the norm. We are more likely to want to shout and shut each other down and walk away. To actually sit and create a situation where we all listen to each other, that is relatively novel in history. And I think the internet in particular has fostered uptick, is putting it mildly, but an uptick in public shaming that's made institutions quick to suspend or fire people over anything that could become controversial on the internet and bring them bad press. And I agree with Lukianoff and Schlott that institutions should establish stronger norms and codes for freedom of speech and toleration and teach it more proactively. Some sense of openness and second chances and listening through to opposing viewpoints. The internet has in many ways brought out the worst of our scapegoating and groupthink and bandwagon and finger-pointing tendencies on all sides. But we should remember that in those zero-sum settings, choosing one book over another isn't book burning. Firing and not rehiring happens all of the time. Discussions about race, gender, representation and values are inevitable, and that reactionaries and the press and sensationalists love all of this stuff as a distraction to print headlines and sell news, because none of it is good for politics. Some of it should be talked about in certain settings, but it doesn't have to be a national, international conversation. And it's not good day-to-day discourse or part of the day-to-day decision-making of politicians. I've always thought that these debates are for anywhere but politics. But if I'm right, that the wokeism complaint is at its core about censoriousness, and that what's being called censorship is actually often exaggerated and more quotidian and day-to-day than those critics want to admit, then what's being called woke will continue. And what I'd also say is, look at those cases we looked at. Look at the FIRE database yourself. Again, I'll link it below. Think about things like DEI and critical race theory and postmodernism and cancel culture and identity and different reasons for getting fired and rehired and hired and changing values. And ask yourself this. If you think it's all good or all bad, then I'd bet you're probably not doing much thinking for yourself at all. Alright everyone, thank you so much as usual for watching, and I really appreciate that you've gotten this far. Just watching the video really helps with the algorithm, and a massive thank you as always to all these wonderful people on screen now who support Then and Now. As I've already mentioned, it's the only way to keep doing this without sponsorship. These long form, in-depth videos that take so much time for us to research, put together, edit, all the rest of it. So I am hugely appreciative, and we're trying to make the Patreon membership more and more valuable to you over time by adding courses. There's already a 2-hour course up on thinking differently about history that goes in depth on some of the stuff that undergraduate and postgraduate history students read about the craft of history, about thinking about history. And I think it's put together really well. People seem to enjoy it. You can join and have a look yourself. You can cancel at any time. The course membership level is $2.99 I think, but you can join for $1 and watch ad-free and early, join the discussion and the rest of it, and support videos like this. If not, please do just press subscribe, press that bell, like, comment, share, follow on social media, All that stuff helps so much. Now I'm going to go back to working on the next video. Thank you. See you next time.